We are rolling. You may go ahead.
Okay, so Patrick emailed you the questions beforehand, and I'm going to go in a linear order out of Patrick advised me on which questions to ask, so it'll make more sense to the audience that we're going to be marketing this to. So my first question to you, Mr. Deloria, is before modern tribal governments, before the IRA, how did American Indians determine membership?
Well, it's a very complex thing. If you went far back to the beginning of the 19th century, you find clear patterns of adoption, intermarriage, and casual relationships, I guess you'd say, that raise all kinds of questions about who is a member of the tribe. And at that point, the government quite often in treaties will say that anyone half-blood or below should take allotment of land and not be tribal members. And then that's finally opposed by some of the tribes because the chiefs now have grandchildren who are mixed blood, and they want them to be part of the tribe so they can get annuities. And so from that starting point, then you move forward, and then there's two ways of keeping track of tribal membership. So people that the tribe accepts as members, who are usually relatives of people who continue to live in a tribal way. The other is making out annuity rolls. You can, the government will recognize certain classes of people as Indians, and then they will arbitrarily say that a certain blood percentage in a tribe makes you a non-Indian and not an Indian. So going up in the 1890s to about 1920, when you're doing allotments, people want to trace back to someone that's either on the annuity roll or was recognized for allotments. And so it's a real mess by the time you get to 1900, that there are all kinds of criteria being used, but often the criteria depends on the treaty or agreement that the tribe has with the government. So you come to IRA, and those IRA rolls are the Bureau and the tribe's best effort to determine what membership is so people can vote on constitutions. Sometimes they have the blood quantum, sometimes they don't. And so out of that, the big issue is always who's eligible to vote in tribal elections, who's eligible to vote for the Constitution and bylaws, and who's eligible to run for office in the tribe. And so depending on the tribe, you have different criteria. But nowhere is there a self-identity thing in any of this. That everyone on any of those rolls, undoubtedly, till about 1930, had two or three of the four grandparents were Indian, without any question at all.
So how does adoption and intermarriage factor into identity then and now?
There was a time you could be a total non-Indian and be adopted into a tribe and be a tribal member. In the Kansas Indians case that went to the Supreme Court, some of those tribes that were parties to that suit have been selling tribal memberships. And so you say, wait a minute, what's going on here? I've run across cases where non-Indians were friendly local neighbors of Indians. and they were put on the rolls by a vote of the tribe. And they thereafter then they weren't Indians, but they were basically citizens of that tribe. And you had all kinds of problems when the 5 civilized tribes broke up, because a lot of these people were citizens of the 5 tribes, but not Indian blood. And so at points you had government intervention, and sometimes you didn't have government intervention. So now you get to IRA, and there are roles where one twin is 3/4 and another twin is half. Same mother, same hospital, same day, and this is the Bureau's the Bureau's statement. And I run across a lot of people into genealogy, and a lot of times the Bureau insists on its own version of the genealogy where it's obviously inaccurate. But then it would be a hassle with the tribal council to get this overturned, so people don't want to do it, or they do want to do it. Out in California, you have tribes trying to disenroll people so they'll get more money, the incumbent. It's just a bowl of spaghetti is what it is.
So with adoption and intermarriage factoring into identity, do certain elements of traditional forms exist in membership today in any tribes?
Do certain elements of
Do certain elements of traditional forms of identity, of how Indian tribes identified before the IRA, do they exist today?
Yeah, there are a lot of tribes that have variants of IRA constitutions, and they're much more traditional. But the key to the Indian identity is, can you identify yourself with a specific Indian community? And that's always been the criteria. If you can go to Haute Villa, if you're a Hopi, and say, yeah, we remember his family, then that's authentication. This works for almost all the tribes. During the real activist days, there were all these people running around shouting, if you're an Indian if you think you are. And most of the people shouting were government undercover agents who were on these marches and things. So, when you see this self-identification brought in, that's only, looking at history, that's only good as long as no one challenges it. The minute that's challenged, then you really have to come up with some kind of proof that you had an Indian ancestor, and that's not always easy.
So with that in mind, I'll go on to my next question. How did American Indian identity manifest into the current criteria of today? And where did the idea of blood quantum get introduced into the equation historically?
What idea of what?
Where did the idea of blood quantum get introduced into this equation historically? I mean, where does that stem from?
Okay, historically it goes to a treaty in the Chicago area where the government was going to eliminate all the half-bloods and quarter-bloods. And the chiefs demanded that Indians of quarter blood be recognized as tribal member because they were the grandchildren of these chiefs. And so the blood quantum doesn't emerge again for a long time until the Waldron case, which is about, well, mid-1880s. I don't know exactly when. This was a lady on the Cheyenne River who had married a white man and moved away. And they started to issue allotments up there. And she felt she was still a tribal member. And the U.S. at that point was like Canada. If a woman married out of the tribe to a white husband, then she was no longer an Indian. and a white woman marrying an Indian man would come in, and they would regard her as a tribal member. Canada had that in law for a long time. It doesn't emerge again till there's an obscure education statute in the 19-teens, I don't know whether it's 14, 15, 16, where the Catholic Church boarding schools are overflowing with children to be educated. And so they ask for a quarter blood quantum, that you can't go below quarter blood in terms of providing services. And so then, when you get to IRA, people say, well, a quarter is, if you got a quarter, then you had at least 2 Indian grandparents. And so then you face the problem that a lot of tribes have if there's so many people below a quarter. So some tribes have changed that. And said, okay, if you're an 8th, or if you can prove you're a descendant to allotment or an annuity roll, then you're eligible for tribal membership. So once you add that criteria, then the quarter blood doesn't seem important because you got people at 1/8. And then you get these tribes up in the little corner of eastern Oklahoma who've been there since 1830s or 40s, who don't have any quarter bloods at all, and yet they have a tribal government, they have a reservation, and they can trace their families back to these chiefs, but there's no one with quarter blood there.
So you said today tribes are changing the blood quantum criteria. Where does that right stem from for the tribes?
Oh, that's an inherent right of the tribe to determine its own membership.
Is that stated within the IRA, or is it?
No, that's generally accepted. There's a solicitor's opinion in the fall of '34 that lists all the inherent powers of the tribe. And based on all those inherent powers, people simply say that a tribe has a right to determine its own membership.
So the United Ketua Band can inherently change the blood quantum from a quarter to however low they want to go without seeking any approval through the Bureau.
Well, you're going to get a fight with the Bureau, because if you go down to 1/8, that doubles the clientele for the public health service and for education funds and roads. So the Bureau's going to fight for the 1/4. And there's been controversy in Oklahoma for a long time about public health service comes to provide services for people of major Indian blood quantum, and the clinics are flooded with people 1/16, 1/8, 1/32. And so the Indians, who are really traditional and represent the most blood quantum, are standing at the end of the line, so they don't like that.
So where does Santa Clara Pueblo v. Martinez, how does that factor into inherent rights?
That upholds the right of the Pueblo to determine its own membership.
Just the Pueblo, or does that affect all Indian tribes?
Well, as a principle, it's supposed to affect all Indian tribes.
Does it?
But then there's a catch. Suppose a corrupt group gets in the tribal government and starts de-enrolling the real Indians, which is happening in California. There's been a state case on that. Now, who does the government owe the trust to? To the tribal government, which is now occupied by a group of bandits, or to the Indians who can trace back to even relatives who were tribal chairman or tribal councilman 2 generations ago? And you see, it becomes a very tricky thing. There are no general principles involved here.
So what are the current criteria of tribal membership today?
Well, you'd have to go to each tribe and find out what they're going to do.
So each
or
tribe
what they've done.
still today determines its own membership?
Yeah.
Patrick, if you have any questions, feel free to jump in.
Well, some tribes, and I won't mention them, were very clever at IRA. When they made up their rules, they listed everybody as a full-blood. Because they figure if the Bureau was so intent on getting blood quantum that they're, you know, they better start with a high blood quantum because they're going to have intermarriage.
Do you think when tribes were adopting this new form of government, were they looking out for the best interests of the members, or was it?
Not at all. A lot of them were forced into IRA because the government decided, in some instances, but not all. They decided that if you didn't come in and vote against the law, that you approved it. So they counted absentees as positive votes to accept IRA. And if you go around through the Indian congresses, you'll find that some of these tribes said anybody who willingly took allotted land is no longer a member, or anyone who sold allotted land is no longer a member. And then Collier just about lost his mind on stuff like that. And so you get a heavy Bureau influence on the quarter blood.
So the IRA doesn't assert the criteria, is that correct? The solicitor's opinion states the inherent rights?
Yeah, the IRA started out as a 4-part major omnibus bill. Collier went out and held congresses to explain to the Indians what the bill was. Almost unanimously they rejected it because it was so new. People in Congress turned the IRA into a Christmas tree, and they each put all of their favorite amendments on it. So you read it and it doesn't make any sense at all. I think at section 19 it says, in addition to existing tribal powers, the tribes under IRA would have the right to buy land, hire an attorney, and I guess sign contracts or something. I forget the 3 things. So that passes. Roosevelt signs it in June of '34. And Collier, who was a very clever politician, he got together with Nathan Margold and some others. They wrote up this massive solicitor's opinions saying we got to answer the question in addition to existing powers. What were the existing powers? So they go through all the litigation, all the statutes, and come up with these variety of rights which they say are inherent in tribal sovereignty. Those are things the tribes never gave up. If you go back to Talton versus Mays, the 1896 Supreme Court, the Cherokees had a different number of jurors for a jury than the U.S. Constitution or Oklahoma Constitution allowed. So the question was, can the Cherokees have a different jury, different grand petit jury, I think it was. And the Supreme Court said yes, because the Cherokee Nation existed before the Constitution. So the only thing that the U.S. has is what the Cherokees gave up in the treaties. Now this is the political counterpart of the Winans case, that if you didn't give up fishing rights in the treaty, they remained with you. See, so it's a very powerful case. So that's where there's another solicitor's opinion in the mid-30s that says that these governments being organized are federal corporations for the purpose of economic development, which means they're not really tribal councils. They're a creature that the Indian nation creates to do economic development. And people miss that all the time. So if something goes wrong with the tribal government, in theory you have the right to hold a general council of the Indian nation involved and have them vote on whatever they want to do. And inhibit that federal corporation from doing things they don't want it to do.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to backtrack one second, is there any general federal criteria for being an Indian that is in spite of tribal specific criteria?
Not that.
No.
No, if I went down my files and made a list of all the people who self-identified, who became very prominent, it would be very embarrassing for Indian country, I'll tell you. Because there's some very high-ranking, well-thought-of people who are not anywhere near Indian blood. And this has been true from, I guess, the turn of the century. You know, after they'd almost killed every Indian in the country, they all wanted to be like Indians. And so a lot of them started adopting all kinds of Indian stuff. You have the improved order of the red man, that they're going to do better than the Indians did. And you get one after another, the craziest frauds going on. And if a tribe's not aware that this is going on, you know, the guy can be very successful and write books and go do pageants, and you got it.
So how much power, sovereign power, does the United Katua Band have if there's an existing relationship with the University of Colorado, a government-to-government relationship? For Colorado to say, Heidi McCann says she's United Katua, therefore we're not going to question it, but United Katua says I'm not.
And I think university should give in. During the activist days, we had all kinds of suspicious people running around. And what you would do is the traditional way you would determine if a person was a member of a tribe. Ask if they knew prominent personalities there. And sometimes you would say, well, do you know John Ross? He's a Kiowa chief and all that. And he'd go, yeah, we do. John Ross was a Cherokee, right? And you'd say, well, where are you from? Oh, well, you know, I'm a Southern Cheyenne. And you say, oh, well, you know, you name some of the villages where there's a concentration of Cheyennes. And if they said, oh, yeah, I'm from East Pork Chop, you'd say, oh, well, do you know so-and-so and so-and-so? And you could give them all kinds of names to see if they're going to misidentify. And I've been all over places in the Sioux Nation where the first thing they ask, where are your folks from? And then I say, well, from Standing Rock, there's no relatives left except Bobby Sherwood now, but because the family's been away from there for 80 years. But my great-grandmother was the sister of, what the heck was his name? I even forgot. Bear something. He was the head of the Yankton A group, their kennel. Mad Bear. My great-grandmother was the sister of Mad Bear. So then the people know those families, and they know the different bands of Sioux, and so, yeah, okay, you're really a Sioux Indian. So, but when you get these people who change tribes about every 5 years, you know, I've seen a guy go from Huma to Northern Cheyenne to Kiowa, and you think, cut it out.
So if federally recognized tribes have always held this inherent right to self-determine their membership, why is there need for this criteria, the enrollment, CDIB?
Well, if you didn't have that, you would have little hippie communes announcing that they're an Indian tribe and trying to get federal benefits from tax exemption on their little hippie land and education rights, all of those things. And the Sandoval case, 1912, says you can't just go, Congress does not have the power to go out and just recognize some group as Indians. Congress has to demonstrate that whatever criteria Congress uses is adequate so that that community being recognized stands on a par in terms of Indianness as federally recognized tribes.
So it sounds like it is a form of protection for the tribes recognized from the encroachers' interest groups.
I went to Dayton one time for a speech. I'm greeted by all these Germanic-looking people at the airport, dressed in the most outlandish costumes you've ever seen. The first thing they wanted to know is if they're going to spend the afternoon skinning a deer skin, would I like to help? And I said, no, I'd like to just go have a cup of coffee and relax. Well, we're the Shawnee Warrior Society of Ohio. We're applying for federal recognition. And I thought, where did this come from? And it's a bunch of overexcited Scandinavians and Germans that were putting this tribe together. So what do? I mean, there has to be some criteria there. When they opened up federal recognition, they had this gigantic list of groups applying to be federally recognized. And you look at it, and the Oakland Intertribal Council or Phoenix Indian Center or whatever, and you say, wait a minute here. You know, there's no historical relationship between the U.S. and this group of people. And most of them, if they're Indian at all, are already enrolled in some other tribe. So what are you going to do with this mess? And of course the Bureau insisted on investigating everything. I would just gone through there with a red pencil and been done with that.
Can I ask a follow-up? Are there any instances in which it would be justifiable for the federal government to recognize a new Indian community?
Well, there have been artificial criteria in the past that when you use present scholarship and you look at the situation, then you feel the tribe deserves federal recognition. And you take the Yaquis down in Arizona, a lot of them, but not all, were refugees from the Mexican Revolution that crossed the border and were given sanctuary. So does the Act of Sanctuary admit that group to federal status? And for a long time they said, no, you have to go to Mexico. Then they got more information on the group and realized that they had gone back and forth across the border for generations, that there was no border, and they got federal recognition. Now I think there's 2 or 3 groups of Yaquis who have federal recognition. And so you ask, why were they blocked in the first place? And you come down to an overzealous BIA guy on his own authority without any justification, sent a letter saying, no, they're not. The Moa Choctaws are going through that today. See, there's all kinds of proof that they've been an Indian community for a long time. They're a group that didn't want to go to Oklahoma. And they maintained a community there. And you got some BIA guy saying, I'm not even going to look at your criteria. So there's justice and injustice on both sides there.
Given the current criteria today, will there be Indian tribes in the future?
It's hard to say. During the Reagan years, this guy wrote a memo saying, if we just hold everything at 1/4, Indians will marry out and that'll be the end of them. And I think people have misinterpreted that as a government policy. I think the guy was transferred soon after he wrote that memo because it got out to the tribes and they said, oh my God, you know, what's the plan here? Now the question is, if you get too much assimilation, then the local anti-whites are going to raise a big fuss over the fact that these people are indistinguishable from us. And why should they have these rights? And you're going to get a conservative Congress who's going to say, yes, you're right. And you look through the 20th century, about every 20 years, there's an effort to get rid of Indians. So it's going to be pretty hazardous, and a lot of these people, you know, who are not running the tribes right, they're going to find they've dug a deep hole for their tribe. It's going to be hard to get out of.
Here's a long question. Actually, it's a 3-part question, so I'll go slow. Is it important for young suburban Indians to distinguish between the Indians of their tribe and all the information put out about Indians in general? That's the first part. And if this isn't part of the current criteria, why is it important to maintain ties to one tribe? That's the second question. And what are the possible dangers, if any, of this type of information being put forth?
What was the first part again?
Is it important for young suburban Indians to distinguish between the Indians of their tribe and all the information put out there about Indians in general?
Oh, yeah, certainly. You've got to preserve your tribal language. You've got to preserve customs. You've got to really look seriously at efforts starting to be made now of going back to a more traditional form of government. And so the tribes who've been very clever in protecting the main body of people, I think are going to become more popular, and people are going to go past those tribes, how they were able to do this. And I think there could be a solidification there. So I would keep in touch with local communities and kind of continue to have established relationships with them. You know, there are a lot of Indians living in the city that drive clear up to Fort Berthold and Sisselton on the weekends, go to powwows and things, and you know, that's a way of keeping in touch. But if you get to the point where they say, we don't know any of these people, then there's going to be a big question if you get an award or if you strike oil or whatever. Are these people really members of our tribe? We've never seen or heard of them. They have no family history they can recite, and should they get part of the per capita? So that's going to come down to an important question. And what was the second one?
You actually answered it in the same answer. So the third part of that question is, what are the possible dangers, if any, of general type of Indian information being put forth? Patrick used to teach a class, and those specifics of Indian religions, what if he were to just lump them all together and dispense this information to non-native students and or Indian students at school?
Well, I think that's happening, and that's one of the dangers I've been really worried about. And a lot of that comes out of Pine Ridge. They've got this missionary attitude. We've got these ceremonies, we can give them to the world. And you say, no, the reason we have these ceremonies is the great mysterious gave those to us. If he wanted the Swedes or the Romanians to have them, he would have arranged for them to have them. And so it's increasingly difficult to protect Indian religion because these people are saying, okay, you've been to a peyote meeting once, you can be a headman if you want, start your own group. We got this white man over in Utah claims that he's authorized to do peyote meetings. And so at that point, the Congress is going to look at this thing and say, wait a minute, what we're doing. We tried to protect the native religion, and they went out and recruited all kinds of non-Indians. And now we've got a problem. Does a non-Indian have the same protection as the Indian does in regard to drug laws. So it gets to be a real mess there. You look up and down the Pacific coast, all of those are Sioux ceremonies that all kinds of people are doing. And they ask them, well, who said you could do this? Oh, somebody at Rosebud authorized me to. They think that attending a ceremony is equivalent to ordination in some kind of priesthood or something.
The United Katua used to have their associate membership program. Is that the same thing as what was happening at Pine Ridge, and people not having the authority to bestow a certain religious ceremony on someone and have them go practice it outside the environment of which it stems from, the associate membership? Is that the same thing? Saying you can be a member, you can be a member, and people going out and appropriating that?
No. When I was director of NCAI, we had memberships and associate membership. Associate membership was for sympathetic non-Indians who wanted to help. Membership was for enrolled Indians who had paid their dues and could vote, participate in the organization. What you have frequently is during election years, these tribes, a number of them, to get publicity, will adopt some politician into their tribe. Well, what does that mean? Full tribal membership or what? Standing Rock adopted Sergeant Shriver one year. The Winnebagos in Wisconsin adopted George Wallace because he was a big name. They didn't know what he stood for. And so you say, well, these are just puffery.
So does adoption with the Sioux Nation have the same meaning as it did before the time of contact?
I don't think any of them have any standing whatsoever. It's just a nice honor. It doesn't cost anything, and it makes the politician feel warm toward your tribe. I'll bet there's not a congressman that ever served in South Dakota who wasn't adopted by one of those Sioux tribes up there.
Will DNA ever factor into the criterion?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but you got to watch DNA because they set a lot of that stuff up to prove what they want to prove. And recently, this idea 70 people crossed the Bering Strait and inhabited 2 continents. I mean, come on. It's just nonsense.
You don't have to answer this question if you don't want to. In your opinion, is Ward Churchill doing an injustice to American Indian identity?
I don't want to answer that. You'd be crazy to jump into that pool of sharks that's going on now.
How about is Heidi McCann doing an injustice to American Indian identity?
It's what?
Is Heidi McCann doing an injustice to American Indian identity?
He won't answer that.
I have one question. I'm just kind of curious.
Well, I've kept out of it because the major question when this started was, this damn essay's been around for 3.5 years, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, backed by Bill O'Reilly, who's to the right of the Neanderthals, all of a sudden it's a bigger issue than Michael Jackson, you know. And so I don't want any part of this. I don't know who the players are here.
Here's, I think, a safer question.
More people, I'm not going to say anything.
Maybe here's a question you might be able to answer. Is why do you think he might have been singled out? And it does bring up a good example of he wasn't the only one. There were people like Noam Chomsky, other writers, even somebody who I'm very familiar with in my own area of Hawaii, Professor Haunani Trask, who brought up somewhat of a similar argument, although perhaps in a different context. Was it just simply wrong time, wrong place for him, do you think? Or do you think he was singled out because of the idea of who we claim as a self-identity?
I really don't know, because I was down in Arizona and I didn't know a thing about this until maybe a month after it happened. One of my wife's friends sent us a big packet of newspaper articles on this thing. So I've been a couple months behind figuring out what's going on here.
You mind if I ask one more question? I'm interested in this. Do you think universities, I'll wait for this one to ring too. Give about 5 seconds here. The joy of editing.
What?
I can edit, but I can't dub over clock sounds too well.
Oh.
Okay. Oh, we got the top of the hour. Okay.
Okay, you got 15 minutes.
Okay. Here's, unfortunately, I think I just have one unless I get inspired for another one. Do you think universities such as CU Boulder could do a better job of establishing relationships with local tribes when it does come to academia, education? Because obviously there have been issues raised.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And they don't. In California, they take the gaming money from the tribes and don't do anything for them. I got a memo from somebody the other day saying, would you help us work this thing up? And we're trying to track down how much tribal money has willingly been given to universities for them to start Indian programs. It's been squandered on non-Indians. We're sending kids to New Mexico and Arizona, but we don't get any graduates. What's going on here? So that issue is about to be put on the table. How exploitive are universities? And you get universities who have scholars that publish the most absurd things. The Indians were responsible for the demise of the buffalo and all of this stuff. And nobody seems to say anything about it.
Do you think universities sometimes try to take the easier way out by looking more for a figurehead than dealing with actual issues?
Well, there's just a thing come out, 33% of U.S. scientists admit they've been fraudulent in their research. once universities are as bad as the Indian situation today. I mean, really.
Well, that's it for me. Thank you. You inspired for anything else? No chance.
I think I'm done too.
Well, that's very informative. Well, we're actually going to save those 10 minutes then, unless somebody hits you now. Relax.
No,
Well, it's so complicated to keep the thing straight. I'd have to it'd take me maybe a couple of weeks to go through and document all those things, get the right year on when it happened or whatever. But I didn't realize that it started so early with the treaty in the 1820s. That this quarter blood thing came up. And when I tried to tell people about it, they wouldn't believe it. So I was end up Xeroxing that treaty and marking around. But traditionally you had this phenomenon of people from one tribe being captives or adoptees in another tribe and rising to the head chieftainship. And earlier this winter I was trying to sort out whether this Chief Sabona was an Ottawa or a Potawatomi. And it turned out he was a Canadian Ottawa who had come down and married into the Potawatomis. And the Potawatomis then asked him to be their negotiator at a treaty. And the treaty involved a conflict with the Ottawas, and the Ottawas regarded him as their chief. So you got one guy who is looked at Indian-wise as a chief of two tribes. And then the government wants to recognize him only as chief of the Potawatomi. You say, what's going on here?
That's interesting you mentioned Potawatomi only because I found out that I'm part Potawatomi, but my ancestry, according to the family line, is hard to trace to tribal enrollment period because it happened from, I guess, a nomadic group that left was the area of registry. Like I know when I checked with the Potawatomi Nation in Oklahoma, they said that at some point the enrollment would have been hard to distinguish from those who broke off at a certain time. So for me, unless it was a DNA test, I'm not even sure what that would prove. It's something that would be possible for me to enroll in or one as a member by their standards. And I wonder how many people, if they could trace, and how far they go back along all these splinter groups.
You got the Shawnees, the Potawatomis, the Ottawas, Chippewa, Miamis, Delawares, all of them, over a long historical period of time, start out as one group of villages. The government comes in and makes a treaty with some of the villages and not with others. Then you have two Potawatomi nations. Then time progresses, they align themselves with the Ottawas or the Delawares. And for a while you have a joint Potawatomi/Delaware tribe. And then part of the Delawares remove. And then you got two Delaware nations, and then the Potawatomis go pull back from them. And you get, and they're among the easy groups to trace. If you look at the Oneidas, about every 5 years, they break apart when you got a party signing a treaty and heading for Wisconsin. And you say, how in the world do you trace it? I've traced the Delawares back and forth and to and fro to New Jersey, to upstate New York, down to where the Miamis were, over to Pittsburgh. I mean, it just... And each time, if the government signs a treaty with a small group of leaders there, that little group is recognized as an Indian tribe. And so you say, wait a minute, traditionally the Delawares had these beloved chiefs and nothing was valid without them. So you had a session in New Jersey where some people who weren't chiefs and had no authority to sign to cede land, ceded the land, and now they want to put a casino there. But where are the original Delawares, and were they consulted before the New Jersey group? You can do this with Seneca Cayuga, you can do it with Onondaga, you can do it with some of the Sioux tribes. And you end up with a manuscript like that and no clear indication of what law should be applied.
It just sounds like a very easy way for a lot of loopholes.
Oh, but it's a bonanza for historians, you know.
Say the least. Do you have anything else, Heidi? All right.
That a wrap?
That is a wrap.
I do have a request, though.
Okay.